I'm looking at a screen with a bunch of questions, and people have been voting on these questions, so we get a sense of what most preoccupies the people who have been listening to your talk. So the first question we're going to go to comes from Toronto. It's, how do we incentivize, regulate industry to take end-of-life responsibility for the materials they produce?
Well, the first thing I would say is that governments and regulators have the opportunity to benchmark for their industries and say it exists, therefore it is possible, and can set essentially goals and standards that are related to these observations they might have on propitious behaviors. Because Jane Jacobs, the famous theorist, urban theorist who moved to Toronto from New York, she pointed out that humans have evolved two syndromes of survival, the guardian and commerce, and that you must keep them separate, because if you get commerce into the guardian, you corrupt it. If you get a guardian into commerce, you slow it down. So I think the guardian could say, here, look at this. The next thing I would do is change the language, because when we talk about end of life, is that what we're talking about? Really? Anybody here looking for the end of life? And when you look at your cell phone, do you think it's alive? It's talking to you, but it's not a living thing. So I think end of use. Design for end of use. Because if you say end of life, then you think, grave or crematorium. You think landfill or incinerator. But if you stop and say end of use, it just changes the nature of the work. And the value of a tool is placed there by the intention of the person using it. So a hammer isn't good or bad. It depends on what I do with it. If I give it to a child, it becomes a toy. If I build a house with it, it's a tool. And if I give it to some mean, crazy person, it's a weapon. So the hammer doesn't know. So I think if the governments and the regulators have the opportunity to say, listen, here are textile mills. They've been designed. The water coming out is clean enough to drink. That's what we're doing in China right now. And they're in desperate condition because their businesses are collapsing because of labor costs and so on. And so they don't have time to fix and change. So we're developing incentive programs for them to do this because it brings down cost and the quality goes up. And you have to do both simultaneously. We're looking at a new idea for China we call the carbon positive city, which I've just put together and I'm getting ready for Paris. And it's the idea of this ancient tradition of the cities feed the farms feed the cities. But we go to a giant scale and start to see carbon as an asset, not just a toxin in the atmosphere. There's poor carbon. It's getting such a bad name. And we are carbon. So I would say that. The first thing is get a positive headset, state your intentions clearly, identify your benchmarking opportunities for people who have already done things like this you can copy, and then get on with the work itself and eliminate the concept of waste.
Great, thanks. So we have about 6 minutes left. I'll try and get a couple more questions in. So what, in your view, is the key barrier to more industry uptake on Cradle to Cradle?
Well, first of all, it took us a long time to get it ready for the public because it's quite precise. And so there's that. I think there is a lot of uptake in the context of circular economy being a fundamental part of it. So I think it's really, right now, I don't see any typical barrier except for business always having difficulty with anything out of the ordinary. So I think there's a real need to put these examples in front of people and inspire them. And the reason I'm in New York right now was to meet with a very large company that's going to go cradle to cradle for its entire enterprise. It's a very big thing. But I think until we were able to get it scientifically demonstrated and economically verified with all kinds of good examples, it's very hard for people to take a theory and turn it into practice. So what we're trying to do here is show that the theory is now being presented quite nicely within the circular economy people, but we actually have examples of qualification, and then we have a protocol you can adopt. So it's just that these things, sustainability is going to take forever, but I guess that's the point.
So then what do you see as the role of government to support industry to reduce the waste-making and convenience goods?
Well, I think on one hand, for example, with sewage treatment, I was surprised and delighted to see Vancouver, with these experiments in recovering phosphate from sewage sludge in Vancouver. producing struvites. And all of a sudden you realize that the phosphates, being pearlized. And you realize that cities can become fertilizer factories instead of sewage treatment plants. And that we can start to think of these things as assets. And cities can do that. They're at a marvelous scale for this. And we can articulate the parts of the city that are residential, and then we can tell the industrial sectors, which are nerve-wracking, and that's why we have zoning to keep things apart. But if you do cradle to cradle with factories, you can safely live next door. And a city can go back to being live-work, just like villages and small towns were for millennia. And so all of a sudden your transit changes because you live-work. You don't need to commute distances because things are dangerous. So I think cities can move toward live-work. And they can move toward having their own food grown locally with farmers being served by fertilizers that come out of the city, just a giant village, basically. Because in China, the farmers, as you know, farm the same ground for 50 centuries. Same in India. And in the West, typically when our soil, was used up, we went west. So, these people were in the same place for a very long time. And they weren't importing phosphate from Kazakhstan or Morocco. They were cycling right there, and I think we can go back to that. And I think regulators in cities can do that. And just to put an edge on it, they can also track assets, through purchase orders and keep an eye on where things are and where they're going, very helpfully. And they can also make money. So instead of a city spending money on sewage treatment and then adding chlorine to nutrients and throwing them in water bodies to do point source and non-point source pollution, from the farmers using fertilizers, all of a sudden you have the cities are not polluting and the farmers aren't either. That's really beautiful. And it looks like the cities can probably make in excess of a 10% return doing this. So they can benefit their citizens financially as well.
Great. Okay, we've got one last question. And it's actually, I think, an appropriate way to end, as it's a question that's forward-looking, and we'll go back to the rest of the conference and consider your response to this question. So the question is, what is the most important concept that you want us to take away and put into action in our personal and professional lives right away?
Well, I think you're so well into it. I would just encourage us all to imagine that you're designing for a 10-year-old, that they're going to be alive in the next century. And they don't understand why we would do anything otherwise. And as we look at the next generations, and we look at the kind of challenges you're putting out there, you have zero waste as a challenge. I have 100% fabulous as a challenge. We're the same people. But look what we're saying to these children. We're saying we're going to do an earth shot. We're going back. We're staying home. Let's go. We're not leaving. What does it mean to be native to place? It means you're not leaving. That's what it means. So let the children know we're not leaving. And when you tell them that, what we can do is say, like John F. Kennedy, when he said, we're going to the moon in 10 years, one of the most impressive facts was that 9 years later, in the response to his urgent need to figure out what to do about the Russians got there first. The first Russian cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, circumnavigated the entire globe the first shot. The Americans took, I think, 5 attempts. But his first shot, he was up in space over the radio, and the first human voice coming from space back to Earth to tell us. They said, what is it like, Commander Gagarin? What is it like? And over the radio, you could hear this voice. And in Russian, he said, it's beautiful. It's blue. It's amazing. And when John Glenn got back from the U.S. circumnavigation of the globe, they said, Commander Glenn, what was it like? And he said, what do you think it was like flying around the Earth in $150 million worth of low bids? One is a values statement about what is beautiful. The other is a value statement about what it costs. But if you really look at what happened with Kennedy's call for a moonshot and the call we're making here today for an earth shot, when you look at the composition of the NASA team that put Neil Armstrong on the moon 9 years later, a year ahead of schedule, the average age was 28. What does that mean? It means that the average age of the people who heard John Kennedy's call was 19. They had just graduated from high school. And that was the average age. So there were 10-year-olds hearing this. And they went to the moon. Give these 10-year-olds the chance to go back to the Earth. We're not leaving.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bill.